Power utility Eskom and certain municipalities in the country are allegedly planning to raise the connection fee for electricity users who also generate their own power. This has caused outrage with some sectors of society, saying electricity supply has become increasingly unreliable and expensive. Let's help get sense of what is happening here. We're joined by Economist Dr. Sean Muller to help us make sense of all of this. Thank you very much, Dr. Muller, for joining us. So when we're talking about the grid connection fee, what exactly is it?
Right, thanks for having me. So basically, Eskom raises revenue from normal customers in two ways. The one is by a charge to connect to the grid, and the other is by the tariffs they charge for electricity. So in this case, what's on the table is the idea of a higher connection charge. And the reason for that is basically because more individuals are generating their own power. So you can't recover as much of the costs for the infrastructure from regular tariffs. So you need to recover more of them from the grid connection fee.
So why has this caused outrage?
Right. So one has to see this in the bigger context around Eskom's crises. So in our view, Eskom has two crises. The one is operational and the other is financial. Everybody kind of knows about the operational side, which is that we have load shedding. But on the financial side, Eskom has about 400 billion rand in debt that they can't afford to service. It's being bailed out by the National Treasury every year in tens of billions of rand. Okay? And one of the solutions that's been proposed to load shedding is to bring more power generation onto the grid from other sources besides Eskom. So both households that generate their own solar energy and municipalities even, but also large businesses doing their own generation. And there's been a recent change in regulations around that. Now the problem is that's going to reduce the revenue that goes to Eskom. So it's going to make Eskom's financial situation worse. And even worse than that is that the individuals and businesses who are going to be able to generate their own power are the wealthier individuals and the wealthier businesses. So they're going to be able to reduce the amount of money, the amount that they're paying to Eskom through these high tariffs. And everybody agrees that these tariffs are very high. But the problem is then Eskom is going to get less revenue, its financial situation is going to worsen. The way it responds to that from a regulatory point of view is it puts up tariffs. But now you're putting up tariffs on people who are less able to pay. So it creates what's known as the electricity utility death spiral. And one of the ways of trying to stop that from happening is increasing the connection fee for these wealthier households and these wealthier businesses.
Right, but you believe the connection fee is fair, especially for the wealthier households and businesses, because when they don't then have their own power, they use Eskom as a backup, so they should be paying.
Exactly, and this is the thing that also hasn't been properly communicated to the public, partly because, unfortunately, the general narrative has been determined by vested interests, both local and foreign, renewable energy industry and others. So what hasn't been communicated to households is that renewable energy has limitations, and in particular, you don't get solar power at night. It's kind of intuitive. So you're going to be relying on some other kinds of forms of electricity, which often baseload, coal or nuclear, or perhaps gas. But when it comes to individual households, if you think about it, an individual household installs their solar system, and they can feed that into the grid during the day. But the periods of time when Eskom most needs additional power are peak periods, which are in the morning and evening, and in winter, that's in the dark. So those households are going to be drawing from the grid at those peak periods, which is actually where the biggest problem is, and they're only going to be able to feed in their electricity into the grid when it's least needed.
This is all confusing because a few weeks ago then the president comes out to announce a myriad of measures, right, to turn the tide where Eskom is concerned. And one of those measures is encouraging households and businesses to install solar, and then eventually Eskom would be buying from these households. So how should we understand this in relation to what we're talking about today?
Right. I mean, this is quite a big discussion, and I'll try and synthesize what my co-author and I have been raising. But basically, we think that push to decentralized generation is premature. We think it's the result of vested interests, including, I would say, some supposedly independent energy experts that keep getting interviewed in the media but haven't declared their funding sources. Okay? So I should say that we don't have conflicts of interest. We've declared that, but many of our peers haven't. But the basic issue is that, and we did a presentation at a conference last week, and one of the challenges I put to the representative from the presidency was to say, why are you pushing through with these decentralization regulations when you haven't costed them? So we hear about Treasury possibly taking over about 200 billion rand of Eskom's debt, but this decentralization decision is going to make Eskom's finances worse. So it's going to mean that Treasury is actually going to have to take on more debt. But unusually, this hasn't been costed. So we don't know what the public finance implications are, but what we can be sure about is that it will make Eskom's finances worse, which means that National Treasury will have to take on more, which means that the general public is going to pay more. But meanwhile, the main beneficiaries are wealthy households and wealthy businesses.
It would appear also from what I'm hearing that those with nefarious intentions are also going to be benefiting, because now we're going to be seeing corruption all over again, right? Because what is being said here is that we're going to ideally privatize Eskom to make sure that South Africans have stable power generation, and we're going to make sure that there's no corruption in this process. But it's not as simple as that.
Well, there probably will be corruption, but actually, even if there isn't corruption, this is the current approach is likely very bad for the majority of South Africans. Essentially, what's happening is that we have organizations and individuals who are also being funded by foreign governments, and this is not a secret, by the way. You can go and read their reports. But these foreign governments essentially wanting to encourage African countries to push very rapidly for an energy transition. They're trying to stop us from exploiting our natural resources, like gas, for example. Meanwhile, the United States, Canada, and the UK, Australia are exploiting their gas and shale gas reserves at a great rate, causing a lot of pollution. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to get African countries, including South Africa, to bear a greater burden of the cost of tackling climate change, which we agree is very important. But in order to have the so-called just transition that everybody keeps talking about, there needs to be justice internationally, and there needs to be justice locally. And on the current path, basically, South Africa is going to pay a higher price for the transition than is fair, in our view, and ordinary South Africans are going to pay a higher price than they should, because wealthier South Africans and wealthier businesses are basically defecting from the grid and pushing the costs of Eskom's historical debt onto everybody else.
So there's nothing just about this transition. I think there was a report that was done by the University of Johannesburg, which actually tracked this load reduction issue, especially in townships, etc. And that it showed how people in townships were being load shed even way before there was load shedding. So what I'm hearing from you now, saying that, you know, South Africans, the least earning, will also be disadvantaged. It will only be the wealthy that will benefit and the wealthy businesses that will benefit. Why then proceed with this? Is our president being ill-advised about this just transition?
Well, I think that's the generous view, and it is the current view that I would take. I think the president's been poorly advised since 2018. One sees this in particular on the financing side, which again is not being reported a lot by the media. But the president had a set of advisors who were supposed to advise him on a finance plan for Eskom, and that still hasn't come to fruition. We've seen a lot of rhetoric about international concessional loan financing and so forth, but now we've reached the point where all of a sudden we're hearing that Treasury is going to have to take on 200 billion rand of Eskom's debt. Now, there might be arguments for doing that, but as I say, when one puts it in the broader context of this lobbying for rapid decentralization of energy generation, which is also going to harm municipal finances, by the way, because municipalities make a lot of money from selling on electricity. So once again, wealthy households and wealthy businesses can generate their own, they don't have to buy as much from municipality. And most of our municipalities are already in a very seriously bad state, financially and otherwise. So this is going to make that worse as well.
Then what options are available to South Africans? Are we just victims that can do nothing about this?
Well, one thing that we need to do is we need to improve basically the public conversation, which includes the media coverage.
Yeah.
So I would say something we're pushing quite hard on is that we need greater declaration of interests from these supposed energy experts. We need more answers from the presidency, for example, which is driving this whole process, but basically have admitted that they haven't costed the implications of deregulation, which is just shocking, because National Treasury, Performance Monitoring and Evaluation of the Presidency have for years been saying, no, we should never allow public policies through unless they've been properly costed. But now they're the ones who are driving these policies and haven't costed them. So essentially, they're kicking the can down the road, and eventually South Africans are just going to be forced to pay for these additional costs while these others benefit. But I think the crucial thing is we need to have more conversations like this with the media, where we put these things out into the public domain to say that there are these vested interests. They are influencing what's been reported in the media. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of pushback. But in the long run, well, and even in the medium run, it's the public interest that's going to be harmed.
In your article, you cite the example of Cape Town and what's being done in Cape Town in helping us connect the dots.
Right. So, I mean, Cape Town was sort of an illustrative example because they were one of the early municipalities to start trying to allow people to feed their own energy into the grid. Okay? And so what we were simply saying with Cape Town was to say they have this additional connection fee for households to generate their own solar power, and they have differentiated tariffs. So essentially these households, when they feed energy into the grid, they get paid at a lower rate than the rate that they pay to Eskom for the energy that they use. And that's right. See, this is what we're saying. That's the right thing to do because the value of that energy is lower. It's being fed in during the day when it's needed less, but also because these households are better able to pay. I mean, these households are not investing in solar energy generation technology because they want to help the rest of the country. They're doing it because over 2 to 3 years, it actually will pay off, given the normal high electricity tariffs. Okay? So it's key to protect Eskom's finances to make sure that these households still pay a fair share, not just for the grid costs, which they will use, as you were saying earlier, essentially for insurance when they can't generate their own power, but also for the 400 billion rand of debt that Eskom has accumulated to build, for example, coal-fired power stations like Medupi and Kusile. Why should those costs just be borne by poor people, for example? So Cape Town, broadly speaking, the structure they use is the right one, but what we've seen recently is that as a result of lobbying, they're now moving as well to have more favorable tariffs for these individuals who are generating their own solar energy, potentially cheaper grid connection costs. And that's the wrong way to go. Okay? So what we actually probably need is higher costs. And that, reportedly, is what's on the table from Eskom. But there have been people who've expressed outrage, as it were, about this. Our view is that these are elites who are going to benefit, who are benefiting from decentralization. And so what we're trying to say to sort of general members of the public is, don't be scammed by this. These grid connection fees, for solar energy generators, those are actually good for you as an ordinary member of the public who's just having to rely on the grid and you're not generating your own solar energy. Yeah. That's good for you, because otherwise, if that doesn't happen, you're going to pay even higher tariffs in the future, because these people are getting to opt out.
So pretty much what we're seeing in Tembisa, for instance, and other townships around South Africa is going to continue if nothing is done, essentially.
Yeah, I think it'll get worse. The current trajectory we're on is going to make things worse. As you say, I'm aware of the report you were talking about. It does suggest that potentially there was a disproportionate burden of load shedding placed on poorer communities. We're seeing disconnections and so forth. And the disconnection issue is another whole discussion as well. But we need to recognize that many people in this country simply cannot afford to pay for the electricity that, to some degree, they should be entitled to use. Sure. And that's something that needs to be addressed, rather than just cutting off entire communities and causing the kind of unrest that we've been seeing.
On this connection fee, I understand that, you know, the more privileged need to pay, but then you also find people who say, I'm far from privileged. I just want a system that works for myself and my household at least. So I'm going to install solar. It's not because I can afford it, but because I don't have a choice because of what is happening in the country. So what do you tell somebody like that says, I can't even afford to pay this connection fee that you want me to pay to Eskom?
Well, my guess is that the proportion of people who are in that situation is extremely small. Because basically, the bottom line is if they are installing a solar system, then they can afford to pay for it, even if they're financing it through debt or something else. The vast majority, it's sometimes very easy to forget how poor the majority of South Africans are. And so there are people. For some people, you know. So there's a research organization in Cape Town which has put together this little tracker where you select where you think you are in the income distribution in South Africa, and then it shows you where you are. And the vast majority of people tend to underestimate how high up, well, especially in the middle and upper classes, basically, how high up they are in the income distribution. So I think, of course, we know that there was massive corruption and mismanagement at Eskom. We know that's and bad infrastructure decisions in terms of investment and so forth. We know that's contributed to the massive debt that there is. We know that the tariffs are incredibly high. Nobody's denying that. But the question is, who should pay? We can't get out of this situation. The bottom line is, somebody's going to have to pay for that Eskom debt. And people shouldn't kid themselves that because we're going to have more renewable energy, or because Treasury, what does it mean for Treasury to take on 200 billion rand of Eskom's debt? It means the public is taking on 200 billion rand of Eskom's debt. And if we don't pay for it now in taxes, then we'll pay for it in the future, or future generations will have to pay for it. So there's no way around it. That debt's been accumulated. We have to pay. The tariffs are high because Eskom needs, even with those high tariffs, Eskom is still struggling and is having to be bailed out by the government every year. So it's a horrible situation for everybody, but the point is those who are more able to pay should pay more. That's a fairly basic principle of public finance.
We're definitely going to be taking this conversation further and inviting you. Dr. Sean Muller is an economist as we continue to take a look at the situation around Eskom. Maybe before you go, just to pick your brain, because the President also announced that next to some power stations in Mpumalanga, there's going to be land that is going to be made available for, did he say wind or solar energy to be generated? Just in trying to understand how much electricity South Africa needs and whether that... well, the cost will justify, or the output will justify the cost that we're going to be putting into making that land available to feed the grid.
Right. So it makes sense to use land that's next to power stations because it reduces the costs of the additional connections of renewable projects. This is, again, another thing that's happened. When you see renewable energy experts, well, many of them who are also conflicted because they're taking money from the industry, but when you see them saying about how cheap renewable energy is, what they're often excluding from those calculations is the cost of connecting those projects to the existing Eskom grid. Okay? So at least if you're doing those projects next to an existing power station, those costs are relatively low. Having said that, there is some evidence from the reporting that's going on that there's a bit of a fire sale of Eskom assets happening right now. And I think there are good reasons to be concerned about whether that's following proper processes, whether it's getting the kind of value that we should be getting for public assets. I mean, a good example is SAA. We're seeing the controversy around SAA. Yeah. What on earth happened with that transaction? Why wasn't the National Treasury involved? And now there's a court case around that. But the bottom line is, these are public assets. So even if it makes sense as a kind of policy move, but there should be close scrutiny about who's benefiting and whether proper processes are being followed.
Fair enough. Dr. Sean Muller is an economist. Thank you.
Thank you.